I've lived in 3 different apartments over the last 7 or 8 years, all rentals, all in dense buildings where nobody really knows each other. 2 were managed by larger property companies, one by a smaller firm that still used the same online portals and ticketing systems. Nothing unusual about any of them. I moved for work or rent increases, not because of problems. My schedule has never been normal. I do contract work that spills late, so I'm usually awake past midnight. Laundry after 1 a.m., trash runs when the chute isn't jammed. Sitting at the kitchen table with the window cracked because the building traps heat. You get used to being one of the only people awake. Apartment living teaches you that most sounds aren't worth reacting to. Pipes, elevators, doors closing somewhere you can't place. You stop trying to identify them. Each lease came with the same stack of documents, digital copies mostly, quiet hours listed in bold, emergency numbers that redirect to third-party services, instructions for the maintenance portal with screenshots that never quite match the current interface. There were always printed notices taped near the elevators, camera coverage summaries, reminders about tailgating, updated key fob policies. In one building, the notices were laminated and dated. In another, they were just laser printed and curling at the corners. All 3 buildings used key access for main entrances. 2 had cameras in the hallways. 1 had signs saying it did, which I assumed meant the same thing. Maintenance requests were logged through web forms. You'd get an automated email with a ticket number and a status that changed from received to resolved without much explanation. That was normal. I didn't expect follow-up unless something broke again. At the time, I didn't think of any of this as relevant. It was just the infrastructure around where I slept. I was awake late, the buildings were quiet, and I assumed that anything outside the routine would show up somewhere official. If something mattered, it would be recorded. If it wasn't, then it probably wasn't important. The first things I noticed were easy to explain, so I explained them. Sounds that fit within what you expect in a building where dozens of people share walls. A door closing somewhere down the hall after quiet hours. Footsteps above me when I knew the unit was listed as vacant on the tenant directory. Pipes knocking at times that didn't line up with water use. None of it rose to the level of a complaint. What caught my attention more were the inconsistencies in the systems that were supposed to track this stuff. One building had floor plans posted near the mailroom, including camera coverage diagrams. They were meant as a deterrent, I think. I remember noticing that certain hallway corners and the laundry entrance weren't shaded. Blind spots, but officially acknowledged ones. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every system has gaps. I checked the maintenance portal a few times, mostly out of boredom during late nights. Old tickets stayed visible after you moved out. There were entries like resident concern resolved, with no description field filled in, no technician notes, just a timestamp and a closed status. Some of them were marked resolved within minutes of being submitted. I assumed automation or bulk cleanup. I submitted a couple of minor tickets myself, one about a hallway light that flickered, another about a door that didn't always latch. Both were closed without comments. No email beyond the standard, "Your request has been completed." The issues didn't change, but they also didn't get worse. I let it go. Monthly building reports were sent as PDFs. Keycard access summarized as totals, not individual events. Elevator downtime listed in blocks that didn't always match my experience. Shared utilities panels in the basement had inspection tags signed off regularly, even when the dates overlapped in ways that didn't make sense. I remember thinking that I was probably just noticing patterns because I was awake when most people weren't. When you're tired, you start lining things up that don't belong together. I trusted that if something was actually wrong, the systems in place would flag it. That was their purpose. It was only later that I noticed how similar some of this felt across places. The second apartment was in a different city, years after the first. Different job, different routine, different management company. I was still keeping odd hours, though. That didn't change. Late laundry, taking calls on the stairs because the signal was better there, sitting up with my laptop while the building settled. The layouts were different on paper, but functionally similar. Long interior hallways, shared utility rooms, key fob access tied to a third-party contractor. The resident portals looked different visually, but the structure underneath was the same. Ticket categories, drop-down menus, automated closure notices. When I went back through old emails, I noticed how often the phrasing matched almost exactly. Subject lines like "regarding your recent concern" or "follow up on building inquiry." The body text was always neutral, focused on reassurance rather than detail. Resident handbooks emphasized community comfort and perception of safety. That phrase came up more than once. It wasn't about incidents so much as maintaining confidence. Procedures were outlined for reporting issues, but the outcomes were vague. Reports would be reviewed, patterns would be assessed. Responsibility shifted depending on the type of issue. Security deferred to property management. Management deferred to contractors. Contractors referenced policy. I started checking public records, mostly out of curiosity. Fire inspection summaries were available online, listed by address and date. Police call logs were harder to interpret, often aggregated by block or time window. Some of the things I remembered lined up roughly, others didn't appear at all. I told myself that was normal. Not everything gets logged publicly. Not everything is searchable. What stood out was how standardized the language was when something did appear. No further action required, unable to substantiate, matter resolved administratively. It didn't feel local. It felt like templates being reused. I didn't think anyone was coordinating anything. That seemed unreasonable. It just felt like the same systems responding the same way to different inputs across different places. Like the process mattered more than the specifics. I assumed that was just how large organizations worked. I didn't get access to anything sensitive right away. It came through a tenant advocacy request tied to a routine data privacy disclosure. I'd filed it mostly out of frustration, expecting a PDF with my lease history and payment records. That was the standard response window anyway. What I got back was a compressed archive, labeled with my tenant ID and a request number. The cover email said it was all applicable records. Inside were folders I wasn't expecting. Incident summaries, mostly redacted. After-hours security reports with timestamps that matched nights I remembered being awake. Internal assessments marked for administrative review. I'm not quoting them directly because most of the text was blacked out, but the file names were intact. Things like IR4472bc.pdf, nightopslog.q3.xlsx, risk flag assessment unit tier 2.docs. The dates spanned multiple years and in some cases predated my lease. What stood out was the classification language. Several entries were marked non-actionable, even when the summary metadata listed multiple residents or repeated occurrences. Corroboration didn't seem to change the outcome. There were checkboxes for follow-up that were consistently left blank. In one spreadsheet, there was a column labeled escalation threshold, and none of the entries I could see crossed it. I don't know what the threshold was. That field was redacted. There were notes indicating pattern awareness across properties, phrases like recurring configuration and known behavior set. No department names were attached, just internal codes. Nothing was flagged as urgent. Nothing was flagged as unusual. Around this time, I started sleeping with a light on in the hallway. Not consciously at first. I noticed it later when I reviewed my power usage logs. I checked my door more than once before bed, but I logged it mentally as a habit change, not a response. I didn't feel threatened. I just felt more alert. Looking back, what bothered me wasn't anything specific in the files. It was how consistent they were. The systems weren't missing things. They were recording them, categorizing them, and deciding they didn't require action. Everything appeared to be working the way it was set up to work. I'm posting this now because the last disclosure file closed the loop in a way I didn't expect. It was included as an addendum to the earlier archive, timestamped months after my initial request. The file name was generic, something like aggregate occupant experience late hours.pdf. It wasn't tied to my unit or even my city. It pulled from multiple properties across different management groups. The language was consistent with the other documents, neutral, summary-driven. Late-night incidents were grouped under a single category that treated them as environmental variables. There were charts showing frequency against occupancy duration, turnover rates, and renewal likelihood. No narratives, no resident identifiers, just outcomes. One section described these events as acceptable loss within standard occupancy models. That phrase appeared more than once. What stood out was what wasn't there. There was no recommendation for intervention unless specific thresholds were exceeded. Those thresholds weren't defined in the version I received. The assumption seemed to be that most residents adapt, relocate, or stop reporting. That outcome was listed as natural resolution. It wasn't framed as a failure, it was framed as expected behavior. I want to be clear about something. Nothing in the record suggests I was singled out. There's no indication of personal targeting or follow-up. I moved apartments, like people do. My lease ended. My account was closed. The system logged that as churn, not an incident. The uncomfortable part isn't any single noise or report. It's the implication that these experiences are already known, already categorized, and already deprioritized. They're monitored in aggregate, not addressed individually. That's just how the documentation reads. I'm not posting this as a warning, and I'm not accusing anyone of anything specific. I don't have a conclusion to offer. This is just a record of what I was able to access. The files exist whether anyone looks at them or not.